This is Coffee with Kelly, a dynamic podcast that's dedicated to driving positive change in school safety. I'm your host, Ethan Woodman, Product Marketing Specialist for Crisis Go, and I'm joined by my esteemed colleague, Kelly Moore, Senior School Safety Specialist for Crisis Go. Our mission is to empower you with essential knowledge, tools, and inspiration required to foster a safer and more secure school environment. We hope this podcast will be the catalyst for transformation in your schools. Join us as we continue to dive into the world of school safety. Well, good morning, Kelly. How are you today?
I'm good.
Good.
There's a lot of energy in the room today.
Might make for a good podcast discussion.
Right? I think it'll be fun, challenging for us.
I think so. So Kelly, do you want to try to say the theme of our podcast today? Can you pronounce it?
Let's try. It's Latin. So that's what Ethan is referring to. It's Latin, and it's Vis Pacem Para Bellum.
I think that's right.
Even if I didn't pronounce it right, it translates to, if you want peace, prepare for war.
It sounds counterproductive, but it makes sense.
It does make sense. And it may sound counterproductive, but this is how our military is developed. This goes way back to hundreds, if not thousands of years of creating safe environments for people to live, and the understanding that if you want peace, you have to prepare for war and prepare in a manner that is greater than those who want to do harm to you.
So how do we translate that into schools?
So that is always the question, is how do we take lessons from centuries ago and translate them into what we're doing today? That's the challenge for us. And when we're talking about, using air quotes here, preparing for war so that we can have peace, if we prepare sufficiently, and we've talked about this in a different context, if we prepare to defend ourselves from an aggressor, war, then the greater the likelihood that we will not have war, because we will show our capabilities. We will have people who believe that if they challenge us, they will lose. And as long as we have that sort of dynamic going on, then we can maintain a safe environment. So how do we translate that to schools? What we're looking at is preparing for any emergency, but specifically as the themes go and all of the activity around school safety tends to be around acts of violence, active shooters, and other acts of violence in our schools. If we prepare all of our staff and our buildings to protect us, and people understand the efforts that we are going through to create a safe environment, then it really increases our ability and the potential for us maintaining a safe environment. We've looked at this many times, and again, from many different aspects, but we've talked about oftentimes we take efforts to keep the intruder, the active shooter, out of our buildings. But as we can look back at many of the previous events, both inside and outside of our school systems, so I'm talking about active shooters at school and active shooters in the public, many of them come from within the organization. So when you're talking schools and commercials, former employees, former students, etc., people who have contact or have been at a place and have access to it, those are the people that are the biggest threat to us. So if they see us and they understand that any attempt at violence is going to be met appropriately with confidence and managed well from the get-go, they're likely going to go somewhere else. We've talked about this, and in fact, this was very evident in the most recent Nashville shooting. I'm going to forget the name of the school, but it was at the Christian school.
Yep.
The shooter there had several different targets, and she picked that one because the other ones seemed like her efforts were going to be more difficult to accomplish what she wanted to accomplish. So this is when we're talking about some of the fundamental crime prevention techniques and theories are you don't have to have a perfect crime prevention solution. All you have to do is prepare and do enough that the criminal, who tend to be very lazy essentially, they're going to go to somebody who hasn't prepared, who hasn't locked their car, who doesn't have security lights, who doesn't have maybe a security cameras or a dog or an alarm system. They're going to go somewhere where it's very easy to victimize the person. It's just a fact of life, of human nature. I have a goal and I want to accomplish it with the least amount of effort out there that I can and still accomplish that. So kind of that's what we're talking about here is if I prepare my school sufficiently, all those in there, and people understand how prepared we are and all of these efforts that we are embarking upon to make our schools safer, the chances of us actually having an incident go way down.
It's like you need a path of least resistance along the same plane as your pathway to violence.
Sure. But within that pathway of violence, you're going to have the path of least resistance.
Yep.
It's there, right? And if you start putting up obstacles and interventions and you turn the pathway around, then it becomes more difficult for them to reach their end goal. And you've essentially succeeded. You know, obviously, we want to remove somebody from the pathway to violence.
Right. Yep.
But chances are we're not ever going to totally remove them. But if we teach them and provide obstacles for them, at some point they're going to give up or they're going to find another place to channel their energy. Right. So
Yeah.
we're trying to buy time. Right. And when we're looking at preparing for war, we have to look at how we really address what motivates our attackers. And we have to start looking at what motivates them and how do we mitigate that? How do we identify that? Right. And you can look to the pathway of violence to understand that. Now, recently I've made changes to the pathway of violence. I added an additional step, the initial step. And this goes on the theory and the premise that we have these 6 major steps within the pathway to violence. We have the grievance, we have the violent ideation, the research and planning, the preparation, the probing and breaching, and then you have the attack, right? So you have these 6 different, I'll call them macro steps. But we've talked about this a lot recently, and we have to understand that there's micro steps in between each of those macro steps, right?
Yep.
So there's like potentially hundreds of little steps before somebody reaches that next major step, right? So somebody who is grieved, they have to take several steps and they have to do several things before they actually reach the step of violent ideation, right? That may be, I feel like I'm being treated unfairly. So that's my grievance. I'm being treated unfairly. So I go to my teacher and nothing happens.
Mm.
Oh, don't worry about it. That won't happen again. I'll talk to him or whatever. And then the next day, that person comes back to our grieved person and says, "Hey, you ratted me out."
Yeah.
Right. And that happens several times. Well, then they start looking at violence as a solution
Basically, of like how do I resolve this problem on my own because
because nobody's
it's not
helping
being
me.
addressed.
Right.
Yeah.
Do I go
Yeah.
to, the teacher who's friendly to me and they can't do anything. I go to my administration. I go to my parents. I go to my counselor. Maybe I'm at going to counseling. I go to all these people and they can't help me. I'm still getting picked on. They're not protecting me. I am whatever. Right. So now they have to resolve that. So when we start looking at all of those micro steps, I realize there is hundreds of steps before the grievance, right? And so I added a step to victimization. So when we start talking about our best opportunity to remove somebody from the pathway to violence, we have to look at all of these little incidences within the school context. You can no longer, in this day and age, with what we know about those who commit violence 8, 9, 10 years from now, we can no longer say, oh, that was just a schoolyard incident. We have to look at every schoolyard incident and see what the context is. We have to address them and see who was victimized and who was the aggressor. We have to document that because that's the very starting point of this.
It's interesting that you could be in the right, I guess. You could be the victim and just based on that be like part of that. Now you're part of that process. Like now you're going to be looked at as could I be mistreated so much that I start to have those thoughts of I'm gonna do this on my own. So it's kind of interesting. It's almost like out of your control, but
It's an interesting dynamic, right? Because there's a
yeah.
transition from, in all of these acts of violence, there's a transition from this sort of victimization to the aggressor, right? So there's this whole process that somebody goes through. And that's what the actual pathway to violence is. It's tracking their transition from everyday student to a shooter, somebody who's going to perpetrate violence on their school or their workplace. That's what this is all about, is tracking that transition and identifying where and when and what is the best intervention we can do to pull them off or at least stop them where they're at. When we talked about threat assessments a while back, we talked about the first grader and the fourth grader. And
Yep.
if you remember that incident,
Yep.
it was thought that this first grader was the primary aggressor. But then when we start to dissect the whole interaction there, it was likely that the fourth grader was the one who started this and was the primary aggressor. But then the first grader switched roles very quickly. So there's concerns on both sides. So we have to, and bullying is a learned behavior for the most part.
Yes.
And some people will argue that. But generally speaking, little boys and little girls aren't born bullies. It's the environment that they're in that they learn that, generally speaking. And it's from that perspective that we have to look at how do we identify and prevent that. And why we're talking about this again is because in the context of this preparing for war to live in a state of peace, we have to look at what motivates people and what prevents them, right? And so when we do this, we have to look at being a little bit more proactive about what it is that we're doing to identify these people early. So when we look at the possibility or the potential for preventing something, there's a quote by a very well-known speaker in California in the law enforcement perspective from a liability perspective. His name is Gordon Graham. You can look him up on the internet. But the premise of his speeches, he's a very good speaker, by the way, keeps everyone engaged throughout the training. He basically says, if it's predictable, then it's preventable. If you can predict something, you can prevent it. The difficulty we have in the school environment is our lack of ability or understanding or capability of predicting when something's going to happen. And oftentimes that's because we're addressing this way too late.
That's for sure.
Right? We're addressing this when we get a threat. And when we get a threat, we start doing the threat assessment to find out how we're going to remove this kid from the pathway of violence. And we literally have probably started addressing this issue 8-9 years too late. Things were happening. And this is the primary reason I added this victimization step. If we start looking at people who are being victimized in the first, second, kindergarten, third grades, if we start looking at who are our victims and we don't start addressing it from the earliest opportunity, then we're going to be dealing with them in some way, because if we don't stop their victimization, they're going to continue to be preyed upon and be victims for the duration of their academic careers. Now, you could argue that, well, not everyone who's a victim is going to go shoot up the place. I get it.
Right.
But if we address people who are being victimized, then we're likely to get those few who will.
There's no harm in, bettering the lives of those who are being victimized.
That's
so
correct.
That they can actually be in a better learning environment. So either way, you're going to win. Yeah.
Right. And at least you're identifying and tracking those who are likely to, right? And so the question comes up is, all right, if we want to prevent these, we have to be able to predict them. How do we do that, right? So right now, the discussion is threat assessment, right? We get a threat and we go into this investigative mode to find out, this assessment mode, as to whether or not a particular person poses an actual threat and so forth, right? So we're trying to find out really the predictability of that based upon somebody's behavior, leakage, concerning behaviors, noticed drop in grades and engagement, increase in use of alcohol and drugs, unhealthy obsession with violence, weaponry, tactical stuff, those types of things. There's lots of them. And we've gone over those before. But we're trying to identify those people and try to predict whether or not they are going to be involved in some sort of act of violence, right? Again, we're looking at it from a reactionary perspective. And if we're to look at the left of bang theory, where there's all of these steps that occurred long before the actual attack occurs, then there are other things that we have to look at, not just the individual, that has that potential. We also have to look at other environmental cyclical processes or influences where we can maybe not predict something is going to happen, but we take statistics like from the FBI, from the US Secret Service, from what have you, and we can say there is an increase of a potential attack. And if there's an increase in a time frame, and we'll get into this in just a second, if there's this increase based upon the time of year that you're in right now, then we can start looking at maybe those people who are already on our radar. Maybe we can start looking at them a little bit closer and look at whether or not we can intervene before that happens, right? So where do we look at? What are we doing? How are we being proactive in identifying and predicting our vulnerable periods throughout the year? So when we look at the ability to predict, we're looking at everything that's available to us. And one of the best statements or best findings put out by the FBI that I've heard to help us do that is the fact that a good portion, a significant portion of acts of violence occur shortly after an extended break. So,
Really?
yeah. And the reason for this, they believe, or at least as I remember it, is because people go home from the break and they're isolated. So if they're thinking about violence and they're thinking about what they're going to do and they're already on this pathway, they're isolated and they go home, and maybe at the beginning of the break, they feel like, okay, I'm not at school. It's no longer an issue. And they start to sort of decompress a little bit, right? And they start feeling a little bit better because there's no daily influence from whoever is causing their issues, right? And so they start thinking, okay, this isn't so bad. I made it. As I'm going through this break, they are, maybe it won't be so bad when I get back to school. And they start talking to themselves and they start saying, okay, this isn't going to be so bad. It's a break. Everyone's decompressing it like I am, and it won't be as bad when I get back there. And then they get back and it's the same. And there's usually maybe a week or so grace period. And then they realize, look, I've tried everything I can do. This is going to happen. And they go back, and in that second or third week that they're back is likely when you're going to have a shooting, if you're going to have one, right? So, and it was interesting. I have to use that word because I believe it was Arkansas, and this was shortly after I read about this study or this finding. It was a part of a larger study. Literally, the day after we returned from COVID, the school district returned from COVID. I think it was like March 1st. There was a shooting. And so if we know that breaks cause additional anxiety and can serve to motivate, and they have time to do their research, they have time to do all this stuff just in case when they go back it's not going to go well. Their plans are finalized, and then all of a sudden they realize that it's the same old thing, nothing's changed. If we understand that, then we can look back and start before that happens, before that return happens, maybe even before you go on to break. If you start looking at those students and whoever else is on your radar, maybe that's the time that we start looking at their potential. And maybe we look at the fact that, if somebody were going to do this, it might be any one of these people, 5, 10, whatever it is, right? So let's start identifying them and looking at them and bringing them in and seeing how they're doing, provide them with some supports, try to figure out what we can do to prevent them from coming back after the break and being that person.
Kelly, why do you think we're not doing this already? Or at least to the extent that we would like to see? If you can answer that question.
I can. It's just anecdotal. So
Yeah.
I think there's, some laziness, right? There's some feeling of, I don't want to be the cause that they do it. So I don't want to bring this concern to the surface. I don't want to give them an idea, right? Some fashion, there's this plausible deniability. I didn't know, right? But if we're looking at red flags, and in the blog, we go into what red flags are and how we interpret those. And, the problem is, we have red flag laws in many states about gun ownership, but that's where it typically stops, right? But red flags are not about gun ownership or access to guns. It's really about the other side of the argument is, what are they going to do if they get access, right? And it's really looking at the warning signs of the behavior and really looking at what are we going to do so that when and if this person gets access to a weapon, they're not going to shoot. They're not going to bring it to school. They're not going to do all of this stuff that we don't want them to do. It's providing that mental health support. It's identifying it. And, there's lots and lots of red flags concerning behaviors. And it's just understanding the context and interpretation. And oftentimes it's, our school staff's overwhelmed. They have too much work. And in some cases, we get back to what we've talked about many, many, many times is, I'm not an expert in mental health or red flags or warning signs, so it's not really my job, right? Let me ask you a question. Do you think bullies believe that they are actual bullies?
I think that, I don't know, I'm trying to actually really think about it now. I'm like kind of going back and forth on it. I think bullies would probably recognize that they're the cause of, like, they're probably doing something that is not proper or positive.
Mm-hmm.
I that's how I would answer that question. Hopefully that makes sense.
It does, but it doesn't answer the question. So the question is centered with, we identify bullying as one of the primary causes for people to act out in violence. Do you think bullies have the capability of saying, I am responsible for this?
No.
That's right. They just think they're more powerful.
Right.
And they think they're just doing what they believe is what's going to get them what they want. And if you said to the bully that you are a bully and I am going to do X to punish you for being a bully, they will likely say, I'm not a bully, unless you were able to articulate, you did this. Well, yeah, that's because, right? They're going to deflect, defer, and blame others and so forth, right? But he did this, but they did that, right?
It just becomes a pointing game,
right? This It becomes a power issue, right?
Yeah.
It's no different than blaming the victim for the result of the attack, right? And we see this all the time in domestic violence and sexual assaults and other crimes where they were asking for it, right? And so they don't have the capability to identify themselves as bullies, right? And I've been a victim of bullying my entire life, off and on by different people, right? I responded to it differently, but even in the workplace, even when I was a law enforcement officer, I experienced bullying from my superior officers because they had the power, right? They didn't come at me with logic. They didn't come at me with procedures and so forth. They come at me with power and said, if you don't do this, I'm going to do that, right? I don't respond well to that, which is why I wasn't about to be bullied, right? All the way up. And so it became this sort of adversarial thing. But if I talk to those people, in fact, when I retired from the sheriff's department, I retired from the sheriff's department because I was being bullied by my superior who was in line to be promoted to the second in command of the department. So he didn't like the way I did things. I didn't like the way he did things. And he went around and circumvented and usurped all of my authority with some of the people who worked for me. So from that perspective, I went in and I said, I want you to understand you're the reason I'm retiring early. His response was, well, let me ask you this. What do you think his response should have been?
Should have been something of the effect of, tell me about it, tell me exactly what I did, and something like that.
Let's talk about it.
Yeah.
His response, Kelly, we are not here to talk about my leadership style. And I said, you're absolutely right. Got up and walked out because there's no sense in talking to that person, right? And especially, so that was one of the primary reasons I retired. And I could retire. I was in a position where I could retire, essentially retired with almost all of my benefits, not all of them, but almost all of them. So when you talk to the bully, then they're not going to identify themselves as a bully. They're going to say, I'm coming, they made me do it. This was their fault, not my fault. So when we start looking at red flags and we start looking at those people, then we have to start looking at them from the perspective of victimizing other people. So if we can address that, then we can really have an impact on the future of safety within our schools. And when we look at people and we can stop them from being victimized, then we can help them cope with what is happening to them, help them manage that, help them get out from under that victimization mentality that's being created. And we see this all the time in society today where it's almost celebrated that you're a victim. People are celebrities because they're victims. And while we shouldn't decrease the result and the trauma caused by being victimized, we've created a culture where people who aren't victims claim to be victims. And things that weren't happening 20, 30 years ago are happening now. And then we're shocked that they're happening. And this goes into the next part of our next blog and our next part of this conversation is do no harm, right? Because when we look at do no harm, we can ask ourselves, what does that mean? And the reason I went into the conversation regarding do bullies identify themselves as bullies was primarily for this reason. We have to look at what we are doing as a society, what we are doing as an organization, what we are doing as a school, what we are doing as an individual, as to whether or not what it is our actions are they causing trauma to somebody? And if they're causing trauma, or there's a potential for trauma to be caused here, felt, then we have to change our behaviors. And we have to look at what we can do from the preparing for war and trying to align do no harm with preparing for war. Those seem in conflict of each other, right? So how do we align those correctly? And when we talk about preparing for war, what we're trying to do is to make sure no harm comes to anybody under my care as a safety official for any organizations, whether it's a school or commercial, government, doesn't matter. But in that preparation, we have to understand that we can cause more harm if we're not properly prepared to respond to. And in response to an incident, we can cause much more trauma to everybody, right? So we often look at even doing drills and exercises. We don't want to do them because they cause trauma. At least that's what people are telling us. We shouldn't do these because it causes more trauma. Okay, well, we're trying to help you protect yourself and the children you're in charge of, you're responsible for. We're trying to give you the tools to do that. And studies have been out there, and the experience is that kids understand a lot more than we give them credit for. And when we tell them, this is what we're doing, we're going to make you safer, and this is why we're doing it, they're okay with that. When we do drills and exercises, if we're doing correctly, then we're building knowledge, experience, and most importantly, resilience. In law enforcement, we train over and over and over again for many different scenarios, which we will likely never see in our career. But by doing so, we increase our resilience and we decrease the potential for trauma based upon an incident that we had prepared for that we really didn't expect we were going to do, right? So when we're prepared, we go into a situation, understanding our responsibilities. We understand our expectations. We can effectively address any circumstance, any event that comes at us if we're properly prepared. We don't have to prepare for a specific incident, just being prepared on how to manage something. We've said this probably more than 10 times over the last year, but it bears repeating here. In an act of violence situation, generally speaking, our law enforcement professionals are trained well enough that they will address that problem fairly well, fairly quickly, and with positive results, generally speaking. I can name 1 or 2 or 3 times where that didn't occur out of all of them that have been handled by law enforcement. But generally speaking, they're going to resolve that issue very quickly. Yet there's a ton of trauma still being created even after the primary issue has been resolved. And we can equate that trauma that's continuing to affect everyone involved, not just the students and teacher theirs, but the family, the community, the first responders, the medical staff, anyone who's involved at any aspect, with any aspect of that incident, is how we manage that incident. If we know what we're doing, we understand all of our roles and responsibilities, we can mitigate the trauma. We can get those kids who can be saved, we can get them to hospitals very quickly. If we don't, and we've seen this in other incidences, where there was confusion, they weren't prepared for this, they didn't have enough resources, they didn't have plans in place, where some victims died waiting to be rescued.
Oh my goodness.
And so we have that trauma. We have all the anguish that's created and trauma that's created for those families. We've had instances where they were completely mismanaged. And if we can manage those correctly, we can reduce that trauma. Right. And if we set ourselves up to respond correctly and we have that ability, then we're so much better off and we can reduce that trauma. I remember telling this story. I think I only told that once, but I'm going to tell it again. I went to some training at a college campus near where I was at, and the training ended up, I was misunderstood what the training was, but it was for emergency response on campuses, but it was really targeted towards school psychologists, school counselors, and those people who deal with mental health and the mental health status of kids and teachers and so forth on campuses. And I was in a class, and there was a panel of three school psychologists. And there had recently been a shooting at a bar where several people were killed. And one of the panelists had several students from some of the adults that were killed at that bar during the shooting. And she goes on to explain her experience and so forth, which was interesting. And then she said, you really need to be careful about the training that you participate in because it causes trauma. I'm sorry. And I said, okay, let's hear this one. And she goes on to explain that she was required to go to a first aid training class. And while at that class, she thought it was just regular first aid. Well, it turns out to be a stop the bleed class.
Those are fun.
Right? But they're a necessary skill for school officials to have.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And stop the bleed, if you're not familiar with it, is a process by which it was obtained through the military because they found out that many of their soldiers were dying en route to the medical care facility because the people in the field didn't know how to stop the bleeding. So now they train every soldier how to stop the bleeding, and that prolongs that time frame in which they have to get viable patients to medical care to save them. Right? So we can see the application in a school setting. So she goes and she finds out how to stop the bleed. And she said, I was completely traumatized. I walked out. I'm not going to do that.
Oh my goodness.
And so you need to be careful with what your training is, was her point. And I raised my hand and I said, I have a question. And she goes, what's that? And then I said, I 100% disagree with you. And she got offended. And I said, now, what skill would you have learned had you stayed there? How to save a life. So you were traumatized by that. And can you imagine how traumatized you would be if somebody was shot right outside your door? You open your door, they're still a viable patient, which means they can be saved. And because you don't know how to tie a tourniquet or pack a wound, something that you can learn in about 15 minutes.
Yeah.
And
literally.
you don't understand that, and that kid died because you didn't have that skill, what trauma is that going to cause? And now you're telling all of these people in your audience that they shouldn't go to this type of training because it causes trauma. So the reason I'm saying this is, are our children being traumatized by training, or are we transferring our fear and our quote trauma to them?
I would guess the latter.
Right. And, children look up to our teachers and our school staff quite a bit, and and how they're supposed to respond. And if our teachers are responding with quote trauma, then they're transferring that to the kids. It's not the training and the exercises are causing the trauma. It's likely that if you look introspectively, you're the one causing the trauma, right? So let's do what we're supposed to do, learn everything, and let's stop causing harm to our kids. Let's look at this and look and see what we can do to give them confidence to go on into the future. I get this all of the time, and that's not my job. I'm not an expert here. I'm just an English teacher, and you know how much that frustrates me.
Oh, I know.
Right? Because it's all of our job. And
Yeah.
our job, when we look at the current status of school safety, our job is not to call 911, not only to call 911 and just wait for somebody to come help us, right? And what is considered a very good response. Average response time is about 5 minutes. In the Nashville shooting, and I'm not going to say this good or bad, 14 minutes it took them to respond. So the question comes in is, what are you doing in that 14 minutes? What can you do? What should you be doing? Those are questions you guys are going to have to answer. And we're looking at what is success when we're talking about responding to and managing these incidences. Now, when we also talk about harm and not doing harm, we're talking about everyday stuff as well. That story about me being a victim of bullying, and that's a true story, is that if I asked those people if they were bullies, they would say no, that it was something I did, right?
Of course.
And
It's your fault.
right. And look, I'm doing the same thing. I'm saying it wasn't what I did. It was what they did. Right. But now we have to look at, what are we doing day to day? We've all seen teachers, parents, administrators, community members with influence bully their way into things. Not one of them thinks they're bullying. But we can all look at behaviors that fall under the bullying spectrum, and we can identify bullying behavior. We should be very careful about how we cause or how we make people do things. If you come to solve a problem, a kid is struggling and they're acting out in some way, and we come at it from a position solely of power, get to the principal's office, and we don't try to solve that problem, we're potentially causing trauma. And just to start wrapping this up a little bit, it's this repeated position, these repeated events that cause the trauma. Sometimes it's a one-time deal that causes trauma. More likely, it's over periods of time that cause trauma. And if we look at helping the student, the parent, the teacher, whomever, if we look at helping them work through their problem, we look at increasing their ability to problem solve, increasing their skills within the conflict resolution realm. We look at them being able to transition from being a victim to somebody who is not a victim and somebody who refuses to be a victim, which builds resilience. And really, that's what we're kind of looking for, right? Is people who can be bullied. And because we're not going to eliminate bullying behavior, because a lot of people don't even know what it looks like. But when you look at actions that are meant to cause some action from somebody else, and that person is using the position of power, then that's what we're looking at for being a bullying behavior. And we've got to look at all these different behaviors that are also associated, right? And what they look at as part of their concerning behaviors and things that we need to understand, right? So we have the victimization, we have the bullying, we have mistreatment, we have fair treatment, respect, conflict resolution, and all of these different actions that we can look at. If we understand all of these potential causes for harm, even some of the things we think are positive, right? Like restorative approaches. In some cases, because there's no consequences in a restorative approach, that means you're really trying to teach the child or the person how to respond correctly. But if you're looking at that same restorative approach for the 10th time, are we really helping the student? Maybe we need another approach. Maybe there needs to be some consequences. Maybe discipline needs to be there. And I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying maybe we need to consider something else. But if we can identify all of these behaviors where somebody's being victimized or have trauma and it's happening over and over again, and we can intervene early in the victimization stage before it becomes a grievance that can't be solved, then we have a much better opportunity to prevent something and to predict it. Because if we're dealing with the same child over and over again, and we should be asking ourselves, what's going on here? How do I fix this? What's the problem? Who's the right person to deal with this problem? Is it me? Is it some professional somewhere? Is it law enforcement? Is it parent? I don't know. But we need to start looking at that to affect those issues and alter their course when they're young and give them the tools to deal with it when they're older. And until we do that, we're not going to really have a chance at stopping violence. We have to be able to do better at that. I'll give you this one little story that we have to stop redefining things for our purpose or to decrease the impact of the statement. I heard on the news there's a local police department. I don't want to name names, but there's a local police department, and they hired a youth and gang violence reduction czar position. And they came out and said, we have reduced, we've had a very successful year. We've reduced gang activity and overall violence significantly. They changed, they're in the process of changing the names from gangs to groups of people.
Yeah, that sounds like it's going to
right?
go well.
Right? So group dynamics or something like that, right? And what caught me more than anything was they were saying how successful they are, but they have a long way to go because homicides were up. So you have all this gang activity, low-level gang activity, and you're saying how successful you are at that. But ultimately, the violence has increased because you have more fatalities, right? If you're just looking at low-level violence as a thing, do you need to look there? Yes. But you need to look at the end result.
Yeah.
because whatever you're doing down here isn't impacting the homicide rate. So you cannot call success by changing the name of what a gang is to a group of persons and then say, oh, we're having more homicides. That's not success. Let's look at what success is. Success is decreasing the number of homicides perpetrated by gang activity.
Yeah, go figure.
Right? So, that's kind of some of the stuff we have to look at. So just to sum this all up, we have to prepare for violence to occur in our schools. We have to do everything we can to prevent it. If we prepare to respond to it correctly and manage it correctly, if somebody is likely to act out in violence, they're going to have second thoughts about that, right? Because they're going to know how prepared you are, because they're likely somehow connected to your school or your organization. If we also try to look at doing no harm and really addressing harm that is done early on, we also have a huge impact on the potential for preventing violence in the future. And that ultimately what we're trying to do. And why are we talking about that in the end of July when we're in a situation with school, we're in a time period of school where there's likely very few schools that are in session, and the chances of having violence in school right now are very, very low. Why are we talking about it right now? Because this is the most extended break we have in our school cycle. And we're going to come back. We're going to do a fire drill because that's easy. That's what everyone does. They try to get back into the mode of school, and really looking at how long are we back in school before we start hearing or seeing signs that there is a potential or an actual school shooting. If you're to believe the FBI results, which I don't have any reason to not believe, because all they're doing is compiling dates and times and how that correlates with the school year, that's going to be 2 or 3 weeks before we start hearing about that. Maybe sooner.
Wow.
Right? So going back to what Gordon Graham says, if it's predictable, it's preventable. Let's try to make it predictable.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And if you have any questions about what we discussed, leave a comment on our website at crisisgo.com. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Coffee with Kelly, a discussion on school safety.